The machine started screaming before I even realized what had happened. It was a sharp, violent alarm that sliced through the quiet room like a knife. Red lights blinked across the monitors beside my hospital bed. The oxygen machine stuttered once, twice, then went silent. And just like that, the power was gone. For a moment I thought it was just a temporary outage. Maybe a blown fuse. Maybe a storm. But outside the window, the neighborhood lights were still glowing peacefully. Only my house was dark. My ICU room sat in the corner of my home, filled with machines that kept me alive after a major surgery. Oxygen concentrators, heart monitors, backup batteries that were only meant to last minutes, not hours. My chest tightened as the oxygen levels dropped. The monitor beeped faster. Somewhere in the house, my wife shouted my name. Daniel. The power's out. I tried to answer, but breathing suddenly felt like dragging air through a straw. Then my phone vibrated on the bedside table. A message from the HOA. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Power disconnected due to unpaid HOA penalties. My stomach dropped. Unpaid penalties? That was impossible. 3 weeks earlier, the HOA president Karen Whitfield had shown up at my door furious about something ridiculous. According to her, my driveway camera violated community privacy rules. The same camera that pointed only at my own driveway. She demanded I remove it immediately or face daily fines. I refused. The cameras stayed. Apparently, she decided to escalate. Another message appeared on my phone. Maybe next time you'll follow the rules. I couldn't believe what I was reading. She had actually cut the power to a house where someone was recovering in a medical ICU room. My ICU room. My wife rushed in carrying a flashlight, panic written across her face. The oxygen machine stopped, she said. I know, I whispered. The backup battery beeped again. 5 minutes remaining. 5 minutes before the machines keeping me alive would shut down completely. My wife grabbed her phone and dialed emergency services with shaking hands. But before she could even speak, there was a knock at the front door. Slow. Calm. Almost deliberate. My wife froze. Through the dark hallway window, a silhouette stood on the porch. Karen. Standing there with her clipboard. Smiling. And that's when I realized something terrifying. She didn't just cut the power. She wanted to watch what happened next. Karen Whitfield stood on my porch like she owned the night. Through the narrow window beside the front door, my wife could see her clearly. Perfect hair. Perfect makeup. Clipboard clutched against her chest like a badge of authority. Behind her, the neighborhood glowed peacefully under streetlights. Inside our house, everything was dark. The oxygen machine beside my bed beeped again. 4 minutes of battery remaining. My wife hesitated before opening the door, but Karen knocked again. Slow. Deliberate. Almost mocking. Finally, the door creaked open. Karen didn't step inside. She simply leaned forward slightly and glanced past my wife into the dark hallway. Oh dear, she said casually. Looks like your power is out. My wife stared at her in disbelief. You shut it off, she said. My husband is in an ICU recovery room. Karen shrugged. Well, technically the HOA maintenance department disconnected it, she replied calmly. Unpaid fines require enforcement. I could hear every word from my bed. Each sentence felt like a punch to the chest. My wife stepped outside onto the porch, trying to block Karen from seeing inside. You can't do this, she said, her voice shaking with anger. He just had surgery. The machines need electricity. Karen flipped a page on her clipboard. Yes, I'm aware, she replied. But community regulations must apply equally to everyone. The oxygen monitor beeped again. 3 minutes. My chest burned as I tried to breathe slower, conserving what little oxygen the failing machine could still push through the tubing. From the porch, Karen continued speaking. "You were warned about the security camera," she said. "Multiple notices were issued. It points at our driveway," my wife snapped. "That's not illegal." Karen tilted her head slightly, smiling the way someone does when they believe they're untouchable. "Perhaps next time you'll take HOA compliance more seriously." Inside the bedroom, I grabbed my phone again with trembling hands. The emergency dispatcher was already on the line through my wife's call. I heard the operator asking questions. "What is the patient's condition? Is there oxygen support equipment in use? Is the power intentionally disconnected?" My wife's voice cracked. "Yes," she said. There was a brief pause. Then the dispatcher's tone changed. Calm. Professional. But suddenly much more serious. "Ma'am," the dispatcher said, "please stay on the line. Emergency responders are being dispatched immediately." Karen heard that. And for the first time, the smug expression on her face flickered. But she recovered quickly. "Oh please," she said dismissively. "This is a private HOA matter." My oxygen machine beeped again. 2 minutes remaining. The room felt colder. Darker. Far too quiet. Then, in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Sirens. Karen slowly turned her head toward the street. And the smile finally disappeared. Because those sirens weren't just getting closer. They were coming here. The sirens grew louder with every passing second. At first they were distant echoes somewhere beyond the neighborhood, but within moments the sound filled the quiet streets like a storm rolling in. Karen stood frozen on the porch. For the first time since she arrived, her confidence seemed to crack. Red and blue lights flashed at the end of the street. My wife looked past Karen and exhaled in relief. "They're here," she whispered. Inside my bedroom, the oxygen machine beeped again. 1 minute remaining. The weak flow of air through the tube felt thinner with every breath. My chest tightened painfully as I tried to stay calm, but the pressure building in my lungs made it almost impossible. In the hallway, Karen spoke again, though her voice had lost its earlier smugness. "This is completely unnecessary," she said quickly. "You people are overreacting." My wife stared at her. "Overreacting," she repeated. "You cut the electricity to medical equipment." Karen crossed her arms. "The HOA has authority over property utilities," she said firmly. "It's part of the community agreement." The first police cruiser turned into our driveway. Its headlights flooded the porch with harsh white light. 2 officers stepped out immediately, followed by a fire department emergency truck pulling up behind them. Karen's posture straightened as if she were preparing for a meeting rather than an emergency. The officers walked toward the porch. "What's going on here?" one of them asked. My wife spoke before Karen could say a word. "She shut off our power," she said urgently, pointing directly at Karen. "My husband is inside on oxygen equipment after surgery." The officer's expression hardened instantly. He looked at Karen. "Ma'am, is that true?" Karen adjusted her clipboard again. "The HOA enforced a utilities disconnection due to unpaid fines," she replied calmly. "This is a civil matter." The officer didn't look impressed. "Civil matter," he said slowly. Behind him, 2 paramedics were already rushing into the house carrying medical equipment. The second officer followed them inside. Seconds later, they entered my bedroom. The paramedics moved quickly, switching my oxygen line to a portable tank. Fresh oxygen rushed through the tube. Air flooded my lungs again. For the first time since the power went out, I could breathe normally. One of the paramedics checked the monitor beside my bed. "His oxygen levels were dropping fast," she said to the officer. The officer nodded grimly. Outside on the porch, Karen continued talking. You see, she was explaining, the HOA board has clear authority under Section 8. The officer interrupted her. No, he said firmly. You don't. Karen blinked. What? The officer stepped closer. Cutting power to a residence with life-sustaining medical equipment isn't an HOA violation issue. His voice turned cold. It's a criminal one. Karen's face slowly drained of color. Because at that moment, the second police cruiser arrived. And this time, the officers stepping out weren't smiling. The second police cruiser stopped directly in front of the house. Its flashing lights painted the entire street in red and blue. Neighbors began stepping onto their porches, drawn by the noise and the sudden chaos. Karen noticed them immediately. She had spent years building her reputation as the powerful HOA president of the neighborhood. Now dozens of curious eyes were watching everything unfold. The officer standing on the porch spoke into his radio briefly before turning back to Karen. Ma'am, he said calmly, I'm going to need you to explain exactly why the electricity to this house was shut off. Karen lifted her chin, trying to regain her earlier confidence. The homeowner refused to comply with HOA regulations, she replied. Fines were issued. When those fines were ignored, the board authorized utility suspension. The officer frowned. You personally authorized this? Karen hesitated. Well, yes. As HOA president. Inside the house, the paramedics continued checking my vitals. The portable oxygen tank hissed softly beside the bed as clean air flowed through the tube. My lungs finally felt stable again, though my body still trembled from the stress. One of the paramedics stepped into the hallway and spoke to the officers. He's stable now, she said. But if the oxygen had stopped for much longer, this could have been extremely serious. The officer nodded. Then he looked back at Karen. Did you know there was medical equipment inside this house? Karen's lips tightened. That's not relevant, she replied. The officer raised an eyebrow. Not relevant. Karen pointed toward the street where several neighbors were now standing. The HOA enforces community rules, she said. If we allow one resident to break them, the entire system collapses. The officer remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke slowly. Ma'am, do you understand the difference between enforcing a parking rule and endangering someone's life? Karen didn't answer. She simply gripped her clipboard tighter. The second officer stepped closer now. Where exactly is the breaker that was shut off? He asked. Karen gestured toward a small utility box near the side of the house. The HOA maintenance contractor disconnected it there, she said. The officer walked over to the box and opened it. Inside, the main line had clearly been pulled. He looked back at her. You ordered someone to physically disconnect this house from power. Karen crossed her arms. As part of HOA enforcement, yes. The officer closed the panel slowly. Then he walked back to the porch. Ma'am, he said firmly, I need you to place your clipboard on the ground. Karen blinked in confusion. Excuse me. You're being detained while we investigate a potential criminal offense. For the first time that night, Karen looked genuinely frightened. Detained, she repeated. The officer nodded. Reckless endangerment, he said. And suddenly the neighbors watching from the street started whispering. Because the most powerful person in the HOA was about to be treated like a suspect. Karen stared at the officer as if she had misheard him. Detained, she repeated, her voice suddenly thin. Yes, ma'am, the officer replied calmly. Please place the clipboard on the ground. For a moment, Karen didn't move. Across the street, neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk. Some stood with their phones raised, quietly recording the entire scene. Karen noticed them immediately. Her face flushed. This is ridiculous, she snapped. I am the elected president of this HOA. The officer remained completely unimpressed. And right now, he replied, you're the person who ordered the disconnection of electricity to a home with life-sustaining medical equipment. Karen shook her head in frustration. You don't understand how HOA authority works, she insisted. Oh, I understand just fine, the officer said. But HOA authority doesn't override state law. Inside the house, the paramedics finished stabilizing my oxygen levels. One of them stepped outside onto the porch to update the officers. He's breathing normally again, she reported. But he absolutely requires constant power for his equipment. The officer nodded. Thank you. Karen tried again to regain control of the situation. This homeowner has been violating community rules for weeks, she argued. The security camera installed in his driveway records public areas. My wife stepped forward immediately. That camera points only at our driveway, she said firmly. Karen scoffed. That's not how the HOA interpreted it. The officer looked directly at Karen. Even if that were true, he said, it wouldn't justify disconnecting electricity from medical equipment. Karen opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. The confidence she had shown earlier was fading quickly. Across the street, whispers continued spreading among the neighbors. Some people were clearly shocked. Others looked angry. One elderly neighbor shook his head and muttered loud enough for several others to hear. She's been abusing her power for years. Karen heard that. Her eyes snapped toward the crowd. You people signed the HOA agreement, she shouted. Every single one of you. The officer raised a hand. Ma'am, that's enough. Another officer stepped forward holding a small body camera. Karen Whitfield, he said clearly, you are being temporarily detained while we investigate possible criminal negligence and reckless endangerment. Karen's jaw dropped. This is harassment, she protested. The officer calmly guided her hands behind her back. No, ma'am, he said. This is procedure. The quiet click of handcuffs echoed across the porch. Gasps came from several neighbors watching. Karen's face turned pale. This will destroy the HOA, she said weakly. The officer looked at her steadily. No, he replied. What destroys communities is people who think rules make them untouchable. Inside my bedroom, I could still hear the voices outside. But something else caught my attention. The paramedic standing beside my bed was staring at my phone screen. Her eyes widened. Sir, she said quietly. You might want to see this. Because while Karen had been arguing on the porch, something shocking had just appeared online. The paramedic slowly turned my phone toward me. What exactly am I looking at? I asked weakly. Your driveway camera feed, she replied. My heart skipped a beat. The same camera Karen had been furious about. The one she claimed violated HOA rules. The screen showed footage from earlier that evening. The timestamp in the corner blinked quietly. Karen stood beside the utility box near my house. She wasn't alone. A maintenance worker stood next to her holding a toolbox. Even through the small screen, her voice was clearly captured by the camera's microphone. You're sure this cuts the power completely? Karen asked. The worker nodded. Yes. Once I pull the main line, the house goes dark. Karen glanced toward the windows of my house. Good, she said. Then she added something that made the paramedic's eyes widen when she first watched it. Maybe next time he'll learn to follow the rules. The maintenance worker hesitated. Ma'am, what if someone is home? Karen rolled her eyes. That's not our problem, she replied coldly. Just do it. The video continued. The worker opened the panel and pulled the main line. The moment the wire disconnected, the lights inside my house went out. Karen watched for a second. Then she smiled. Perfect. The footage ended there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then the paramedic looked toward the doorway where the police officers were still outside. You should probably show them this, she said. I nodded slowly. My hands were still shaking slightly as I called out. Officer. One of the officers stepped into the room. Yes, sir. I held up the phone. I think you need to see something. He walked over and watched the video in silence. By the time it ended, his expression had changed completely. That's very helpful, he said quietly. Outside on the porch, Karen was still arguing with the other officer. This entire situation is being blown out of proportion, she was saying. The officer inside the bedroom turned back toward the door. Stay here, sir, he told me. Then he stepped outside. My wife stood near the porch railing, watching nervously as the officer approached Karen. What now? Karen snapped. The officer held up the phone. We just reviewed your actions on the security camera you were complaining about. Karen froze. What camera? The officer played the video. The entire porch fell silent. Karen watched herself on the screen ordering the power disconnected. Her face slowly turned pale. That's taken out of context, she said weakly. The officer didn't respond. He simply looked at her calmly. Then he spoke into his radio. We're upgrading the charges. Karen's eyes widened. Charges, she whispered. The officer nodded. Reckless endangerment, he said. Criminal negligence. He paused for a moment. Then added the final words that made Karen's knees nearly buckle. And possible attempted manslaughter. Because now there was video proof. Karen looked like someone had pulled. Karen looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under her. The confident HOA president who had stood on my porch earlier now looked completely different. Her shoulders were tense, her face pale, and the clipboard that once made her look powerful was now lying forgotten on the porch floor. The officer held the phone in his hand while the video finished playing again. The small group of neighbors standing in the street had gone silent. They had all just watched the same thing. Karen ordering the power cut. Karen saying, maybe next time he'll learn to follow the rules. One neighbor shook his head slowly. I knew she was bad, he muttered. But not this bad. Karen immediately tried to recover. That video doesn't prove anything, she said quickly. You can't hear the full conversation. The officer looked unimpressed. We heard enough. Another officer stepped forward. Ma'am, you knowingly ordered a power disconnection to a home where medical equipment was in use. Karen's voice grew louder. I didn't know about the medical equipment. From the porch, my wife immediately spoke up. That's a lie. Everyone turned toward her. You were told, she continued, pointing directly at Karen. 3 weeks ago when you came to our door complaining about the camera. Karen's eyes flashed with anger. That conversation is irrelevant. But the first officer shook his head. No, he said. It's very relevant. Across the street, a few neighbors were now openly recording the entire situation with their phones. Karen noticed. Panic flickered across her face. You people better stop filming, she snapped. One younger neighbor responded immediately. Why? He asked. So the HOA can fine us too. A few people laughed quietly. Karen's control over the situation was slipping fast. The officer stepped closer and spoke firmly. Karen Whitfield, based on the evidence we've seen tonight, you are under arrest pending further investigation. Karen's mouth opened slightly. For what? She demanded. Reckless endangerment, the officer replied. Criminal negligence. He paused briefly before finishing. And interfering with life-sustaining medical equipment. Karen looked around the street as if searching for someone who would defend her. But the neighbors weren't stepping forward. Many of them looked angry. Some looked disgusted. The officer gently guided her toward the police cruiser. You can't do this, Karen insisted weakly. This is HOA business. The officer opened the back door of the cruiser. No, he said calmly. This stopped being HOA business the moment someone's life was put at risk. Karen hesitated one last time. Then the officer helped her into the back seat. The car door shut with a heavy click. Across the street, the neighbors whispered among themselves. But inside my house, I barely noticed. Because the paramedic standing beside my bed had just looked at the monitor again. Her expression suddenly changed. "Sir," she said quietly. "We might have another problem." The paramedic stared at the monitor beside my bed. Her calm expression from earlier had vanished. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice still weak. She leaned closer to the screen and checked the readings again. "Your oxygen levels are stabilizing," she said slowly, "but your heart rate is still dangerously high." My wife stepped closer immediately. "Is he going to be okay?" The paramedic nodded cautiously. "He should be fine now that he has oxygen again. But the stress his body just went through was serious." She turned toward the other paramedic in the room. "Let's prepare him for transport," she said. My wife looked confused. "Transport?" "Yes," the paramedic replied. "He needs to be monitored at the hospital tonight." Outside, the police cruiser carrying Karen had not moved yet. The officers were still speaking with several neighbors and documenting the scene. Inside the bedroom, the paramedics carefully disconnected the temporary oxygen tank and replaced it with a portable unit attached to a wheeled stretcher. The room that had felt like a small ICU only minutes earlier suddenly felt temporary. Fragile. As they adjusted the equipment, one of the officers stepped into the room again. "Sir," he said gently, "we're going to need a statement from you once you're able." I nodded slowly. "I'll give you everything," I said. The officer glanced at the equipment beside me. "You're lucky that camera was there," he added. I couldn't help but let out a quiet breath. "The camera she tried to find me for." The officer gave a small nod. "Sometimes the evidence people hate the most ends up saving them." Outside the window, flashing lights still reflected off nearby houses. Neighbors continued watching quietly from their lawns. The officer stepped back toward the hallway but stopped for a moment. "There's something else you should know," he said. My wife looked up. "What?" The officer sighed. Karen wasn't acting alone. My stomach tightened slightly. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward the porch where several other people had gathered. "The HOA board approved the disconnection order earlier today." My wife's eyes widened. "You're saying they all knew?" The officer nodded. "At least 3 board members signed the authorization." For a moment the room felt silent again. Because suddenly this wasn't just about Karen. It was about the entire HOA leadership. Outside, another police vehicle slowly pulled onto the street. Not a patrol car this time. A dark sedan. The officer noticed it too. His expression changed slightly. "That," he said quietly, "would be the detective unit." My wife blinked. "Detectives?" The officer nodded. "Once a case involves potential attempted manslaughter, it stops being a simple arrest." The front door opened as the detective stepped inside the house. And suddenly this neighborhood dispute had turned into something much bigger. The detectives entered the house with quiet authority. Unlike the patrol officers, they moved slowly, observing everything: the medical equipment, the portable oxygen tank, the darkened ICU room that had nearly become a tragedy. One of them introduced himself. "Detective Harris," he said, showing his badge. He looked at the paramedics. "Patient stable." "For now," one of them replied. "But he needs hospital monitoring." The detective nodded, then turned to me. "Sir, I know this has been a long night," he said calmly. "But your security camera footage may have just become key evidence in a criminal investigation." My wife stood beside the bed, still holding my hand. What happens now? She asked. The detective glanced toward the street where Karen sat inside the police cruiser. Well, he said, first, that footage will be logged as evidence. He paused for a moment. And then we start asking questions. Outside, the quiet suburban neighborhood that usually slept peacefully at night had turned into a scene no one would forget. Neighbors whispered in small groups. Phones recorded everything. Karen Whitfield, the once powerful HOA president, now sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car. Her authority had disappeared in a matter of minutes. But the biggest shock came next. Another officer approached the detectives carrying a folder. "Sir," he said. "We checked the HOA documents." Detective Harris opened the folder and flipped through a few pages. Then he let out a slow breath. "Well," he said quietly. "That makes things even worse." My wife looked worried. "What does that mean?" The detective looked at us seriously. "The HOA doesn't legally have the authority to disconnect residential power." For a moment, nobody spoke. The detective continued. "In fact," he said, "the only entity allowed to shut off electricity is the power company itself." My wife blinked. "So what Karen did was completely illegal," the detective finished. Outside, officers were now speaking to several other people, likely the HOA board members who had signed the authorization. What started as a petty dispute over a driveway camera had just turned into something far bigger. The detective closed the folder. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, he said. "And I've seen plenty of HOA disputes." He looked toward the darkened breaker box outside. "But I've never seen someone risk a man's life over one." The paramedics began wheeling my stretcher toward the front door. As we passed the porch, Karen looked up from the back of the police car. Our eyes met for a brief second.
For the first time since the nightmare began, she looked afraid, and the moment I realized something, she thought the HOA rules made her powerful, but tonight provides something else entirely. The law still mattered more, and she had just learned that the hard way.